everybody. Welcome to this lecture in the Capstone presentations of the Capstone presentations. I'm doing philosophy. Now, philosophy has kind of a bad rap as being, well, boring. But I want us to think about philosophy as having in common something with every other intellectual endeavor. What a philosopher tries to do is to find the patterns in the world, to find the patterns in our human experience, and to make sense of them, to use those patterns to give the world shape and coherence so that we can understand ourselves better. So what a philosopher tries to do is to find those patterns, use them to make sense of the world, use them to make sense of ourselves, to help us understand who we are, and most importantly, to help us understand what we're here for and where we're going. Now, in that, philosophy is really no different than any other intellectual exercise. It's no different, for example, than what happened when the apple fell on Newton's head. I know that didn't really happen, but in the story, the apple falls on Newton's head, and he asks himself, what does this tell us about the world? And he uses that question to get to gravity. Gravity is really just a pattern. It's a way of making sense of the world. What Newton did is what a philosopher tries to do. It's what a theologian tries to do. It's what anyone who thinks carefully about the world tries to do. In fact, we can usefully distinguish philosophy and theology precisely on that level. What a theologian tries to do is to take what we call special revelation, the way in which God has revealed himself specially to us through the Bible, through the incarnation, through the coming of the Holy Spirit. A theologian takes all of those special revelations and finds the patterns in them, makes sense of them, gives them coherence and shape so that we can understand them better. Well, a philosopher does the same thing, only a philosopher's frame of reference is different. Instead of working on special revelation, a philosopher works on what we might call natural revelation. So what a Christian philosopher tries to do then is to find the ways in which God has revealed himself in nature. Remember Romans 1:20? God is revealed in the things that are made. So a philosopher takes that seriously and tries to find those places and then find the patterns, make sense of those patterns, and use those patterns to give coherence and shape to the world. That's all a philosopher tries to do. And it really has in common with every other intellectual activity. In fact, philosophy is really the oldest intellectual activity. It's the one that gave birth to science. In some ways is closely related to theology in that way. It's a very ancient endeavor going all the way back to the beginning of human civilization. And all those times, that's what philosophers have been trying to do. Make sense, find patterns, give coherence and shape. We call the shape, the patterns that a philosopher finds, we call that metaphysics. There are three branches of philosophy, metaphysics, epistemology, and ethics. Metaphysics is the fundamental one because metaphysics is the fundamental pattern that a philosopher finds in the world. And in the history of philosophy, there are really just two. There are a couple of others, but really they all boil down to two. There's the Platonic metaphysics, the Platonic pattern, and there's the Aristotelian metaphysics, or the Aristotelian pattern. So we're going to look at those two and think about how that metaphysics, the way in which these two perspectives give shape to the world, how those produce a way of being good in the world, ethics, right? We want to know what it means to be good. But to do that, we start with that fundamental pattern, that fundamental shape that a philosopher finds in the world. So Platonic, Aristotelian, or Plato and Aristotle. So we'll start with Plato. Plato believed that the world is fundamentally corrupt. His fundamental pattern that he found in the world was decay. When he looked around the world, he asked himself, what am I seeing? Right? What is it? What is the kind of fundamental human experience? And what he realized is that we're all in this long process of decay. You are born to die, right? Have you ever heard that phrase? You're born, and from the instant you're born, you start this long process of decay. Sometimes it's not so long, right? But it's this process, and it's inevitable, it's inescapable, and no one regards it as a good. To grow old, to decay, to fall apart, to be corrupt, right, no one really sees that as a fundamentally positive experience. And so Plato wanted to make sense of that. Plato wanted to understand how it is that this is the human experience, right? If I understand my life through this process of change and decay, then why is that? And what does that mean about who I am and what it means to be good? So he started to work this out. He worked this out in a couple of different ways. The most famous way is one you may have heard of called the allegory of the cave. Now, in the allegory of the cave, what Plato said was that there's a cave, and in the cave there are prisoners. These prisoners are chained in such a way that they can only see the back wall of the cave. So they cannot see out of the cave, they're looking in the back of the cave. There's only one light in the cave, which is behind them. So behind them there's a light, it's a fire, which is casting limited amount of light on the wall in front of them. So they can only see this kind of reflected light. And so what happens is the captors parade objects in front of the fire, back and forth in front of the fire. So you can imagine a duck, so they march with their duck in front of the fire, or a pig, or an automobile, or whatever, in front of the fire. And so what you get on the wall then are just the reflections, the shadows, he calls them, of these objects reflected on the wall. And so this is what the prisoners think reality is, because it's all they have, it's all they know. So they look at these shadows reflected on the wall. And Plato says they actually get really good at distinguishing one shadow from another. You can tell different species of ducks, right? And so they talk amongst themselves and they categorize these. Or it's like driving down the road, you pick out the different kind of cars. Well, they get really good at distinguishing between a BMW and an Audi, right? As it parades in front, the shadow parades in front of them through the light. Now, his point up to here is that despite the fact they spend a lot of time and energy learning to distinguish one shadow from another, it's still a shadow, right? All that they can see, all that they know is not real. There's no reality about it at all. It's just a reflection. It's not the car itself. It's simply a shadow of the car reflected up on the wall. And in a way, he wants us to see that all human endeavor to make sense of this world, right? Anytime we try to analyze this world, to make sense of this world, is just a lie, because all we're looking at are shadows. Now, the allegory goes on. What happens is one prisoner breaks free, finds himself unchained somehow, and turns around and sees the light and recognizes that there's something sort of fundamentally wrong here. And eventually the prisoner is able to escape the cave altogether and get out, not only see the artificial light, but to get out of the cave and see the sunlight, see real light, and is blinded momentarily because the light is so bright and his eyes can't adjust. But then learns to see the world around him as it really is, to see the true world, to see the reality as it really is. And that person goes back into the cave and tries to tell everybody about the cave, and they don't want to hear it. The prisoners don't want to hear it, and so they kill him. You can see why Christians love this allegory, because it becomes a way of understanding who Christ was. Christ is the one who came to tell us the truth, and we killed him. But for Plato, Plato meant the person to be Socrates, right? His mentor, who was executed by the Athenians. It's kind of the same idea that we're trapped in this world in which we cannot see the truth. And we have to get out somehow, but we don't know how to get out, because all we know are these shadows. And we think they're real. They're corrupt, they're not real, but we think they're real, and we act as though this is all that reality is. That's Plato's metaphysics. Now, you can see how Christians like this. There's the Christ metaphor that sort of attaches to Socrates. But Christians are very comfortable talking this way, too. This world is not our home. The truth is only that which exists in heaven, and we're off to escape this world and to get to heaven. That fits very well with the Christian message, especially if you attach an understanding of the fall to this, right? Sin is corruption. Sin is a falling away from the truth. And in Genesis, we are expelled from the garden, we're expelled from reality, and in a way sort of sent to the cave. We now live in this world that is corrupt, that is hard to live in, where there's pain in childbirth and we have to till the ground and all that stuff that Genesis describes. Christians latched on to Plato very easily. Now, what does this mean about ethics? Well, for Plato, ethics means that we have to find ways of escaping. We have to find ways of getting out of this world. And he discusses this from a variety of different angles. So one is, he really wants us to learn to distinguish the difference between what is true and what is false. And he thinks that that's really the philosophical task, is to start to identify things as shadows, and then learn to tell the difference between what is a shadow and what is actually real. So for example, just yesterday, I was downtown. I had a hamburger at a place called Stock and Barrel in Knoxville. If you ever come, I will take you down to get a real hamburger at Stock and Barrel. And it was great. It was about a half pound of beef. It was perfectly cooked. It's supposed to be locally grown beef. It was beautiful and juicy. It had Benton's bacon, locally grown bacon on top, and then little crispy fried onions on top of that, and blue cheese on top of that, and then the bun was perfectly cooked. And so they brought this out, and it's just like, oh, it's the most beautiful thing you've ever seen in your life. So that's a real hamburger. Now compare that. So imagine that, right? You've got that in your mind. Imagine that next to one of those little frozen patties you get in the frozen section at whatever your favorite supermarket is, right? So put those side by side. Which one's better, right? If you're offered a choice between one and the other, which one are you going to choose naturally? What Plato says is, we mostly choose the frozen one. We have to learn to tell the difference and learn to prefer the other one. He thinks it's possible, but it's very, very difficult because we're so trapped, we're so trained to think in terms of the shadows. So we see the frozen one and think, hamburger, when in reality you could have this beautiful Stock and Barrel hamburger with the bacon and the fried little onions and the cheese and everything. You could have that, but most of the time we choose the other. What Plato wants us to do, this is ethics, this is the good, this is our task as philosophers, is to learn to tell the difference so that we can choose the good over against the shadow. That's the primary thing he wants us to learn to do. Now, the way to do that, and this is kind of the second thing, the way to do that is to start to pursue beauty as an end. Plato has a lot to say about beauty, a lot to say about virtue, but a lot to say about beauty because he sees beauty as being permanent. Beauty is not temporary. Beauty is not transient. Beauty is not corrupt. In fact, beauty is the opposite of corruption. If you've seen something corrupt, it's not beautiful. If you see something beautiful, it's not corrupt, for Plato at least. And it's the pursuit of that beauty then that becomes the primary ethical task. If we can figure out what beauty is, then we can learn to tell the difference between what is corrupt and what is incorrupt. If we can learn to prefer beauty, then we can start to prefer the things that are true. And it's when we do that, when we look at the range of choices we have, when we look at the hamburger choices we have, and we choose the good one, right? We choose the one that is real. We choose the one that actually exists. For Plato, that's ethics. Then we're acting in an ethically moral way. We're doing the right thing because we're choosing that which is true. Okay, so this is a good time to wrap up the Plato part of this. For Plato, the world is fundamentally corrupt. That corruption seeps into everything, and it prevents us from seeing that which is real. We prefer the shadows. We prefer the little frozen hamburger. What he wants us to do, then, is to find ways of escaping that corruption. He wants us to learn the difference. He wants us to find that which is true and learn to reject that which is false. Okay, Plato. Now, let's turn to the second option. We had Plato, now let's turn to Aristotle. Aristotle was Plato's student, and in some ways, he tried to surpass his teacher, his master, by rejecting almost everything that Plato said and addressing the patterns, finding a different set of patterns in the world. It's almost a completely different set of patterns from that which Plato identified. For Aristotle, change is a fundamental good. Plato rejected change as corruption, but Aristotle looked at change and thought, that's actually not such a bad thing, because change, if it's done well, almost always means growth. So Plato looked at the world and saw we are born and then we die, right? We just grow, we corrupt until we reach the point of death. But Aristotle didn't think that way. Aristotle thought, no, it's actually fun to grow. It's actually fun to change. The rewards of learning something, the rewards of becoming better at something, the rewards of growing into a different kind of person, those are really profound and deep. And we have to make sense of that, right? It's not enough to simply say, every time I grow or every time I'm changed, I'm taking one step closer to my death. We have to recognize that there's something really fundamentally positive about that experience. So what Aristotle's after is a way of understanding that process, that change, that helps us understand those deep patterns that are built into the world. Change is a good because change is correlated with growth, or at least in Aristotle's mind, change correlates with growth. And so what we want to do is grow. As you might guess then, the fundamental virtue for Aristotle is growth. So if you can manage your change in such a way that you grow, then you are being a good person. The way to be a good person is to grow. So then the question is, well, how do I grow? What is the proper way of understanding this Aristotelian growth? And he thinks about this in a couple of different ways. One way is he understands that there is kind of psychological growth. Aristotle invests a lot of energy in talking about the importance of poetry, the importance of drama. He was really interested in the formation of Greek drama because he saw in the arts, a search for psychological maturity. In fact, he loved tragedy. It sounds a little strange for someone who's so positive, right? But he really loved tragedy because he thought tragedy tapped in this kind of emotional state and helped you see the world in a more mature way. If you can confront tragedy, then you're able to deal with the world in a much more sophisticated and mature, right, is a more grown-up kind of way. This is why, have you ever noticed that all Disney movies, almost all Disney movies, have the parents out of the picture? And oftentimes they start with some sort of tragedy. Think about Bambi and some of the other great Disney movies. There's a tragedy that sort of lies behind the entire experience. Well, from an Aristotelian perspective, that's a good thing because confronting that tragedy, even as a kid, is the pathway to growth because it builds psychological maturity. It helps you grow up emotionally and intellectually. So that's one way he talks about how to grow. Another way that Aristotle talks about how to grow is to think about growth through virtue. Now, for Plato, as I said, virtue is a static concept. There is an absolute sort of standard of beauty in Plato's world that everyone should strive to attain, right? That hamburger, there is an ideal hamburger, and we should keep working to attain that ideal of a hamburger. But Aristotle doesn't think that way at all. Aristotle thinks that virtue itself is kind of a dynamic concept. And so what that means is virtue is often the mean between two extremes. So for example, the virtue of courage is the mean between being totally afraid, the flight factor, and being totally foolhardy. And if you can find that mean between those two extremes, then you've attained virtue. So for example, I had two dogs. We used to have two dogs, one named Remy, who was beautiful but dumb and really afraid, and we had another one named Tyler, who was round and stubby but really dumb and brave. And so we had a next-door neighbor dog who was very mean, and one time we let the two dogs out at the same time, the next-door neighbor dog, who was really big and mean, and the big mean dog attacked my two dogs. And the one really pretty but dumb one ran, just turned tail and ran. It took us 3 hours to find him. He was cowering under a bush down by the river, literally. But the other dog, the sort of stubby, dumb one, just latched on, just went toe-to-toe with this big dog, and we had to pull him apart before he got eaten alive. Well, Aristotle would have said that neither one of those dogs displayed true courage. What they should have done is found the happy medium between that instinct to just flee and that instinct just to fight even though you were going to lose, right? Courage is the medium, the mean between those two extremes. Now, as you might guess, This is a pretty dynamic concept because what that mean is always shifting depending on the circumstances. There are circumstances where the mean sort of slides more towards flight. There are circumstances where the mean slides more towards staying and fighting, right? And learning how to judge that circumstance so that you find the true mean, that's a growth process. That's something you have to learn through experience, through intellectual endeavor, right? Through growing up, through growing. So it's a very virtue, and any virtue, any of the great virtues, you'd be able to trace them as a mean between two extremes. And so what a courageous person does is learn to tell that. What a virtuous person does is learn to judge the circumstances and to act in a virtuous way within the context of those circumstances. But again, this is a skill. This is something you acquire through trial and error, through growing up, through becoming a changed person who grows to maturity and experience. Okay, one last thing. You can see how Christians might really be happy about Aristotle too. They loved Plato, but Aristotle has a lot to say about Christian virtue as well. At least Christians can appropriate a lot that Aristotle said. One thing, Paul, is the use of athletic metaphors. Paul, in his epistles, talks a lot about running the race so as to win the prize. Well, that's a very Aristotelian way of thinking about the world. You want to grow. You want to discipline your body so that you can grow in virtue and courage and all those other things. Well, Christians latch right onto that. And discipline, the Christian discipline, the spiritual disciplines, arise out of this kind of Aristotelian way of making sense of the world. Okay, so we have two basic options. We have the Aristotelian option. We have the Platonic option. They're very different. One is a kind of escape from the world to this kind of deeper reality that exists somewhere else. Another is an embracing of the world. Aristotle really wants you to inhabit the world in very deep ways. They offer two really different ethical perspectives. Plato wants you to be ethical by tapping into the true virtue, by learning to tell the difference between the corruption we experience in our day-to-day life and the deeper reality that lies out there. Aristotle, on the other hand, wants us to grow up. He wants us to mature. He wants us to discipline ourselves, to work hard so that we can become better people through growth and change. The question for the philosopher is which one? Which pattern makes most sense of the world? Which pattern helps us deal with the circumstance that we find ourselves in? And finally, which pattern tells us best who we are? Who am I in this world? And what am I going to be in this world? That's the question for the philosopher.